we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Yeah.
What's our cold open?
I think, honestly, us talking about how much we love this essay.
I do actually love this essay.
I'm not kidding when I said I was absolutely feral. I usually, 14 pages usually takes me a bit of time to go through because I have ADHD and I can't concentrate on things. And this one, I was just zoomed in. I was like, I'm in. I've cracked the code.
I've become camp itself.
It's like... It kind of feels like, in the movies where the hacker's like, I'm in. That's me. I was like, camp.
I've been coming up to you because we now live together, by the way.
Yeah, we do.
We do now live together. I don't think that was the case.
We live together as actual roommates, not as the quote-unquote historical connotations of roommates.
Yeah. Yeah, we live together, and I have just been appearing in the living room whilst you're watching whatever horror movies all month, and I've just appeared and been like, is that camp? It's been good.
Yeah, I am the Susan Sontag of our household. I'm giving you notes on camp.
Paula's notes on camp.
I think this means we've started.
Yeah, we've started. We're ready. Welcome to Theoryish, the podcast you're listening to and you clicked on, and hopefully you know what you're listening to.
And I'm Paula Medina.
I'm Hannah S. Hi, no guests today.
No guests, just us and slamming doors of Warwick University.
Yeah. If you hear the slamming doors, sorry.
Give us enough money to have a studio.
Yeah.
No, that would be camp. Okay, so today's reading is the 1964 seminal work, debut essay by Susan Sontag, Notes on Camp. So to start off, did you like the text, Hannah?
I had so much fun with this. There were points where I audibly laughed out loud. It was so much fun. And it's really well written. Yeah, it's just fun. I had fun Googling all the references because I just did not know what anything was.
Yeah, and I'm usually a big pop culture girly, even if it's from the 1800s. And there were some of these things I'm like, I have no idea what this was. And I was like, well, now this is going to be my personality for the next couple years. Because there's so much that she mentions, Tiffany Lamps, camp. I was I couldn't argue. I was like, Susan, you're onto something.
It did make, there's one point in the first couple of notes, right? Because it's literally given as a bullet point list. There's a little couple of paragraphs.
Which is camp.
But bullet point list, one of the notes is just a list of things that are camp. Which is great.
Yeah, and we're going to mention, because one of them, I'm obsessed with the person that she mentions, and they're rarely ever mentioned in anything. So, camp. I think you can tell. I obviously really love this text. I've read it before. I haven't read it in 10 years. I read it just because it was always referenced in other things I was reading, especially as we're going to get more into the actual structure of this episode. This essay, well, one, is a good cultural point, but also it is a huge point in basically any art after the 50s. Things as campy or kitsch and all these words that are, I think, part of our very big vernacular now, started off as art points. And yeah, should we start with Hannah? What is camp to you?
Okay, right. This is the thing. If I look at something, usually I'm right about it being camp, right? And even before I read this, but now I've read it, I'm getting in there, right? I know if something's camp. I still can't quite explain why. Even after reading this, and we'll go through it because there's loads in here and we'll see.
So the funny definition I've come up with is, to me, Shrek 2, not camp. The fairy godmother performing Bonnie Tyler's hit I Need a Hero in Shrek 2, that is camp. The fairy godmother with the purple hair, with the red dress, being a villainess and singing I Need a Hero, that changed my life forever. I will never be the same.
Yeah. See, this is what I mean. When you say this to me, it makes sense. But I'm still trying to figure out why, and I'm still getting through that.
Yeah, so let's start.
Yeah. So before we go into kind of the introduction of the text itself and some of the background of the text, who's Susan Sontag? Why this?
In my notes, I wrote, who isn't she? So she is an essayist, political activist, writer, director, and novelist. She has since passed away. She was born in the 1930s and died in 2004, I believe, in New York. She was born and raised New Yorker, and she is buried in Paris. That is camp. She's infamous, obviously, for her essays Notes on Camp, Aesthetics of Fascism, and On Photography, and Illness as a Metaphor. These are all essays. The ones I work with a lot in my degree are obviously her writings in On Photography and The Aesthetics of Fascism. It is a great essay, highly recommend. She also directed like a couple films. She was a playwright, and she's also widely known as an activist. She spoke out against the Vietnam War. She was a big supporter of people during the AIDS crisis, and even down into her death. You know, she lived through 9/11, and she was very outspoken about that. Without getting too political, you can disagree or agree with her points, but regardless, till the day she died, she was in the culture. And I think that's why when we approach Susan Sontag, we're like, okay, she's not a philosopher. So far, we've discussed a lot of like theorists and philosophers and all that, but she's not any of that. She's first and foremost, I think, sees herself as a novelist, writer, and political activist, not even an essayist, which I think is really fascinating because we're also treating her work like theory. What do you think?
It is. I think it's theory. Mm-hmm. I think, we have to talk about this being her first essay ever.
Can you, this is her first published essay.
Yeah. First published essay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think there's something really interesting
and
about
I read this on a Wikipedia. This could be a lie.
It could be a lie.
But we're not gonna double check, because we're what? Historians.
Wikipedia can be good sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
I stick by it. But I think treating this as theory, because it has had such a cultural impact, right? We'll talk about it a bit later, but I think there's something interesting about Sontag's notes on camp being taken as what camp is today, especially with things like the Met Gala and stuff like that. But we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. And she didn't really see herself as like the number one voice of camp.
Yeah.
Or the definer of camp, but just sort of like viewed it and tried her best to explain it to the layman.
If we think about what came before camp, which was kitsch.
Yes. So how I came across this essay when I was a wee little undergrad was when I was studying modernism, which is my original degree track. This is why this essay I think is really close to my heart. I was studying modernism and the rise of like the New York art scene, especially after the First and Second World War, because as you may know, things were going down. So a really interesting precursor that I think we should read in the future as well, but it's more of an art history essay than it is theory. It's very complicated. It is Avant-Garde and Kitsch by Clement Greenberg in 1939. So Clement Greenberg basically starts off explaining what kitsch is and commercialization and how the avant-garde is using that in their paintings. And this is being written in 1939, so this is way before you have pop art and more of that like very obviously commercialized goodness, which I think kind of paved the way for a definition for camp. Because if anything, Sontag wants to let us know that camp has existed before this essay. It has existed before the Clement Greenbergs of the world. It has been here all along. It's just taking on a new face, a new craft. I mean, calling it more craft than actual performance. So Clement Greenberg kind of acts like a precursor with the word kitsch, but the word kitsch is also really complicated. So I just wanted to put that up front, that we're not going to be discussing Clement Greenberg, but this is coming out of an already existing dialogue within the art history spaces, especially in New York City, where both of these theorists, essayists, whatever you want to call it, are living. So I think New York City also is a big point in this.
Yeah, because you were saying earlier that this is definitely, it's an American essay. Like, you can tell it's got Americanisms in there.
If anything, America's a great exporter of pop culture. Not the only exporter of pop culture, as few of you may know, I am a one-host stan. I will talk about K-pop whenever I want. But America's greatest export is pop culture. Like, no matter where you go, someone is either going to quote Mean Girls, Friends, or Stranger Things more contemporarily. This is sort of working in that, like, tradition of American commentator. And that's why I kind of want to call Susan Sontag a cultural content creator and commentator. Because she makes her own things. Like, these essays are not original. She's sort of talking about what's already happening in the culture, but yeah, she's sort of holding a mirror to American pop and just going, this is interesting, right?
Yeah, and we were also talking about how camp is extremely hard to define. Like, look, it takes a whole essay for Susan Sontag to even come close to providing a definition, because really providing a two-liner isn't gonna cut it.
And I think with here is a great time to actually start talking about the text itself. Like, we did a lot of talking before this, but we sort of had to cement the groundwork for this type of essay. I would say this is in the Benjamin, if you listen to that episode, in the Benjamin tradition, where this is a short but hearty essay. And I think a really good place to start is, it's the first page. I'm going to do a couple select quotes. So this is not all together one quote, but different parts of that first page. So, a sensibility as distinct from an idea, one of the hardest things to talk about, but there is a special reasons why camp in particular has never been discussed. Camp is a badge of identity, even among small urban cliques. To talk about camp is to betray it. To patronize the faculty of taste is to patronize oneself. So these were like 4 distinct quotes I put together to make it sort of as close to a definition as we possibly can. Because she even says she doesn't know how to define camp. She can only sort of describe it. And even she says, like, as we're breaking it down, we're losing the camp.
Yeah.
Which I think you mentioned is a really good closeness to Benjamin on aura, where the more you replicate the thing, the more it loses its original self.
To start the kind of discussion of the text, I think one of the things that is useful to discuss is camp as kind of manufactured and its relationship to nature. We're going to put in the show notes the actual link to the essay, because there is a kind of free link online that you can follow. And if you want to look at this further, particularly notes 7, 11, 13, and 16 specifically talk more about nature. And in this, we can kind of talk about Art Nouveau. So I'm going to kind of let Paola take the lead on this one because of your art history background and your amazing
Oh, don't call it amazing.
No, but it is your amazing kind of ability to just point to specific things.
It's $30,000 of debt. So camp is manufactured. So points 7, 8, and 9 talk about that camp does not exist in nature. And she's describing forests and trees and just like water and all these things. They're not camp. And the reason is because that is, I think, a source. It is sincerity. It is what it is, but it doesn't try to be self-reflective. So she makes a really great point that camp is a manufactured creation. It is acknowledging that something exists in the world and you're able to point back at it with genuine appreciation. So you can't look at a fire and be like, that fire is camp. Maybe the comment that you say can't, like, this is getting very meta, but like the commentary that, oh my god, fire is camp, that would be the camp statement, not the fire itself. Because the fire is just fire. A mouse is just a mouse, unless it's Ratatouille. That's camp.
But Ratatouille's created, right? Like,
So camp itself is already like an artificial being. And I think that is a quite out there statement. Like, camp is not real, but like it isn't. Nothing is intentionally camp. It just is. Kind of like breathing. You don't think about breathing, but you just naturally do it. So I think it's really important that the first points that she makes are like, not nature, move along, but instead goes to uses of Art Nouveau, which is a lot of Art Nouveau architecture and art uses nature as an element. The thin strands, the way things smoke and like twirl around, are playing around with things that are aesthetically pleasing within nature and then making it artificial. Especially Art Nouveau is existing in a time where mass production was like finally it. People could go to a shopping mall and have like a very kitschy experience where like you're going to the shopping mall, you're going to Macy's or shopping centers and department stores like Harrods here in London. These are very opulent storefronts. They're over the top, but it's kind of sincere in what it's trying to present. And I'm talking about like the Art Nouveau part of this time period and even actually to now. But everything is just like mimicking nature. Like you would see these displays that are like a home, but it's absolutely artificial. And I'm not saying those things are camp per se, but it is the imitation of nature, and that performance in itself could lead to something being camp. So the final point, I've been going around in circles, but it feels kind of maddening explaining this part of the essay. Because, nature is completely abandoned. And I know this is an audio format, so we can't show pictures, but just the Parisian metro stations and all these things, they're trying to imitate something very the aesthetically pleasing version of nature, and that in itself is camp.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about nature being kind of imitated, and I was looking up all the kind of things that were listed and spoken about, and earlier on, I can't remember which note it is, but there's a load of things kind of listed, and you can get the idea of the like Art Nouveau-y type things. So yeah, thinking about camp as manufactured, I think if we kind of move on to the next point that I wanted to talk about, which was camp and dandyism, because I think dandyism, for some reason in my mind, relates to this manufactured, almost like persona. So Susan Sontag talks in the essay about the modern dandy and about how camp can be kind of, let me find the exact quote. Camp is modern dandyism. Camp is the answer to the problem how to be a dandy in the age of mass culture. And dandyism, the best way I can describe it, just Google a picture of Oscar Wilde and that you have a dandy, right?
Well, there's a form of dandy, because dandy also goes way before Oscar Wilde. Like the dandies have been around since, I want to say, like forever. Let's be honest, since forever, especially if you look at Elizabethan times with like the cod pieces and just like putting bows on it, and it's just like you're drawing attention to a specific spot, sir. But that is a form of dandyism. But I think like peak dandy is, like you said, Oscar Wilde, and just men being men amongst men and hanging out. And I don't want to equate it to homosexuality per se.
Yeah.
It's more about the aesthetics of opulence and ridiculousness, because a lot of the dandies dressed absolutely nuts. Look at like specifically, I think before Napoleon III, you can buy these pieces of like clothing and like specific fabrics, and the dandies would go, but what if I make it bright purple? And you know, these are very expensive inks. So dandyism was also associated with a specific social class because they were the only ones that could afford to have these extra pieces of clothing and then do it ridiculously. Especially dandies used to go on walks. So they would be wearing these very over-the-top pieces and going on a walk. So there's people in like the standard uniform black or blue or, you know, the very standard clothing types and a top hat. And they'd be like, what if I have a neon orange one? You know, these colors obviously didn't exist, but it's more about the exaggeration of the costumeness. I can even think back all the way to colonial times in the States where people used to have giant wigs and put boats in it. That's pretty camp.
So one of the notes basically says that when we're talking about this opulence and stuff like that, so note 46 says, the connoisseur of camp has found more ingenious pleasures, not in Latin poetry and rare wines and velvet jackets, but in the coarsest, most commonest pleasures in the art of the masses. So we're kind of moving, it is opulence, but it's a more manufactured mass culture opulence, right? So going back to the quote, mere use does not defile the objects of his pleasure since he learns to possess them in a rare way. Camp, dandyism in this age of mass culture, makes no distinction between the unique object and the mass-produced object. Camp taste transcends the nausea of the replica. And I think this links back nicely to the kind of Benjamin episode where we were talking about aura. We were talking about what does it mean? Does replicating something take away from the aura? And if you haven't listened to the episode, please do. But we're essentially talking about does reproducing something take away almost like the value, but not value in money, value is in
originality, or it's going back to like beliefs of truth. Like the original is the original truth, and then the more it's replicated, it loses a bit of its originality or itself, so it loses its original intent or aura. I think comparing this with the camp essay is very good. I didn't even notice it. She pointed it out.
Wow. I'm growing smarter by the day.
My 2 degrees in art history could not prepare me. Shooketh. No, but it's a great point. It's a fantastic point even. Because camp doesn't care about the original aura. It cares about how that aura is represented. So I would say like Benjamin talks about the preservation of the original intent, and camp actually sort of works like the antithesis of it, because camp is more of like a sensation or feeling. Even if the original intent was fully honest and all that, camp is more concerned about how it was received, even if it's on an individual or cultural level.
This is interesting, right? Because dandyism is also about the audience, right? You cannot be a dandy without the audience. I'm thinking again of Oscar Wilde because that's just, I'm stuck with Oscar Wilde because Oscar Wilde's mentioned a lot. But Oscar Wilde, you know, this is a time when, and I cannot remember the time period off the top of my head, but this is at a time where masculinity, like a kind of almost like Victorian masculinity, we dress in black or brown. We wear very, we don't become showy, right? We're not trying to show off. We're becoming, there's a specific word for it, but it's very like, almost like a stern masculinity. And it's really interesting, but Oscar Wilde's just very,
screw that.
Yeah, screw that. I don't want to look plain. I want to be exciting. I want to be seen. And it's that wanting to be seen that I think is interesting.
I think it's wanting to be seen and just wanting to have fun.
Yeah.
Because there's a difference, and I think Sontag makes it a huge point. There's a difference between wanting to have attention and then just radiating attention because you're just enjoying the thing that you're doing.
Yeah, and I think this is where the note 48, this quote, I had to read it out. I had to thrust it in here because it's so funny. So where the dandy would be continually offended or bored, the connoisseur of camp is continually amused, delighted. The dandy held the perfumed handkerchief to his nostrils and was liable to swoon, and the connoisseur of camp sniffs the stink and prides himself on his strong nerves, right? That's fun!
That is so fun. And like, we were joking about this because it reminded me of John Waters in that scene in Pink Flamingos where Divine is literally eating
Cat poop.
I think that's camp. Just like, yeah, it's being able to laugh at yourself and still stand by what you do. And it's a very difficult thing to say. And I think a really big point in one of the points, and this is a huge essay, right?
There's like 55, 56, 57.
Yeah. And this is a very small point, but it's been ringing in my head, is that parody is not camp. Parody can be camp, but it's not camp. So she was using Hitchcock as an example, like specifically North by Northwest, which is a great film, but it's more about like Hitchcock kind of making fun of himself in a way where it's like, making fun of my own media, whereas like other people would be like, yeah, no, this is funny. Let's make this more ridiculous. And that is the difference in it. So it's also what makes camp so difficult to define. Because you can't say, oh, it's parody, or it's like extravagance or opulence. These are all factors, but it doesn't make it camp.
It's kind of like a sweet spot, isn't it? It's something that hits on many things, but it doesn't have to have all the things, which is also difficult.
Which is why it steps away from dandyism. Dandyism takes itself so seriously to a point of detrimentality. Where like Oscar Wilde, I think, is the perfect example because he never took himself too seriously. No, never. Like
he wanted to be silly.
Silly
he
girl.
wanted to go to parties and just have fun.
And that is why it like steps away from dandyism. Dandyism, it views itself on that edge of like, well, if I don't do this so seriously, it's gonna go away. And I think that's what like she means by like, yeah, they would take like a handkerchief because it's still based also on class. So it wasn't open to seeing the dandy in other forms of lower classes, different races, different backgrounds, etc. And that was the detrimentality, whereas camp in a way is a little bit more inclusive, but that is also a tenuous position to take.
Yeah, we can talk about it in a moment because I think I want to dig more into this idea of genuineness versus kind of originality, and also thinking about it's not good versus bad taste. There's something else in there, and the idea of sincerity.
Yeah.
I have a quote that could potentially start us off if you want.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So, note 34. Camp taste turns its back on the good-bad axis of ordinary aesthetic judgment. Camp doesn't reverse things. It doesn't argue that good is bad or that bad is good. What it does is to offer, for art and life, a supplementary set of standards. So I think this is a nice place to kind of start off on this conversation.
Because I think camp sometimes gets confused with bad. And like, I love me a bad film. So I would say The Room is good bad taste, but it's not camp. Death Becomes Her, iconically camp. And it's like, what is the thing that makes it so great? So like, it's like both things are genuine and original, but one of them is not camp. One of them is not like the others. So I think that's where like the genuine versus originality tends to take form. With The Room, I think it loses its campness when the director just goes, oh, that was a parody, and then changes it back to not being a parody. It was sincere. And that flip-flop loses the camp. It loses, like, let's throw in a Benjamin word, it loses the original aura. Where it could have been taken as really high camp. It wasn't. Meanwhile, Death Becomes Her is technically not a good film, but it serves looks. but it serves, it gives. And it's just beloved, and it just doesn't step away from itself. And I think that is where camp sort of rests. It's like commitment to being genuine, not being an original thing.
I wanted to ask you kind of what does like taking just a tiny step back, what does genuine and sincere kind of mean to you? And then thinking about that in relation to camp, maybe.
I think sincerity can work towards camp, but it doesn't really fall through, because sincerity is just being honest with the medium, saying that the canvas is a canvas. That's a sincere statement, and you mean it, but it's genuineness, I think, is something else. It's about saying the canvas is canvas and I love it, and meaning it. So I think there is sentimentality attached with it. So sincerity with sentimentality, I think, is genuineness. Whereas like sentimentality without sincerity is not camp. Like what comedians say, commitment to the bit.
Yeah.
It's full on head first commitment to the thing. Yeah, like I think once more John Waters is a really good example. John Waters loves good bad taste dynamics, and there's many interviews of him. One of them I was really lucky to have seen when I went to Ohio State, where he was being interviewed, and he was just like, yeah, my films are technically don't fall under good. I'm paraphrasing, I'm not direct quoting, but he's like, my films like don't count as good, but why would I make something that's considered a good film? And it's about commitment. It's like, no, this is a really good expression of an idea, and obviously that can take many forms. You have things that are very culturally impactful, like Hairspray, and then you have like Crybaby, you know? So it's about just commitment to the bit and not stepping away from it and being like, no, I stand by this and I mean it 100%. And I think a really important part that is also added to this is not harmful.
Yeah.
So you cannot call racism camp,
Yeah.
which is a commitment to a bit that shouldn't be committed to.
Yeah.
And I think it's detrimental to the essay that Sontag brings this up so late in the game. We're doing this out of order, but we kind of rearranged it because this is how she ends the essay. And I think it should have been thrown a bit more early so that you could break it down a little bit more. Or maybe it's because we are now like looking at this, 50 years in the future.
Yeah. Something like that.
Yeah, almost 60 years in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's genuineness that's not harmful to its subject, and that it's not harmful to itself. It is about like having pure appreciation, pure joy, and reveling in the stink.
It isn't on our notes, but there was something interesting I found like throughout where Sontag's talking about pure camp. There's things that are camp, and then there's a pure camp, and you kind of reminded me when you're saying it's like a pure joy. You feel that thing 100%, right? Whatever that thing is. I wanted to kind of move us along to thinking about class, homosexuality, and gender.
Yeah, she brings it in.
I've got the quotes and stuff if you want me to start.
Please.
So it kind of starts with note 50 and then is expanded a little bit in 51, 52, and 53. But note 50 says the history of camp taste is part of the history of snob taste, but since no authentic aristocrats in the old sense exist today to sponsor special tastes, who is the bearer of this taste? Answer, an improvised, self-elected class, mainly homosexuals who constitute themselves as aristocrats of taste. To expand on this a little bit before we talk about it a little bit more, in note 52, she says, homosexuals have pinned their integration into society on promoting the aesthetic sense. Camp is a solvent of morality. It neutralizes moral indignation and sponsors playfulness. And I think there's something interesting here about the idea of playfulness, the idea that a certain class will give you the ability to have that playfulness, but also in this kind of modern time, homosexuality allows you to also still have that playfulness, right?
Yeah, I think it's something that she doesn't mention, but I think is inferred because of class, homosexuality, gender, all these things. These are all things that are ostracized from society, from like the status quo. So she's sort of inferring that tastes used to belong to the bourgeoisie, but these are all people that were ostracized from society. Like, women did not have equal rights at this time. It is 1964.
Yeah.
Gay people did not have rights at this time. And there was a huge class divide, because this is also New York City in the 60s. Specifically, Midtown and Manhattan are starting to kick out all the people of color to build things like the Lincoln Center. Like, in the Heights, those were the Heights. They no longer exist. So these are now the tastemakers of culture, because they're having to live with each other in very tight-knit spaces and create their own ways of living through this. And rather than be depressed by it, they're making really fun things. We're gonna have this note later on when it comes to race, but specifically with homosexuality, class, and gender. These are people that have to live in the same spaces and occupy the same spaces. But the number one thing that they're trying to do is survive. So they're gonna make really cool art. They're gonna make really cool commentaries on these things, these lived experiences. And these are attractive because they don't belong in the status quo.
And it's also going to be 100% genuine, 100% sincere, because it's just people living their lives. It's just people existing. It's, a thing that's also interesting if we think about the gendered part, which I think is interesting. I think you could expand on a bit more, because some of the people that, I've got pictures of them in front of me, but some of the people that she mentions are people like Greta Garbo, Jane Mansfield, Steve Reeves, Betty Davis,
Marlene Dietrich.
So all these people, specifically Steve Reeves is for an exaggerated he-manness, Jane Mansfield is for a flamboyant femaleness, and Greta Garbo is an androgynous vacancy, right? These are the reasons. So I think there's an interesting thing about when you're saying committing to the bit, it's almost like committing to that androgynous nature. It's committing to that I'm He-Man. Like, if the picture I've got of Steve Reeves in front of me is like him standing, posing with full muscles, Speedos on, the
full muscles,
strongman
type of thing with a little tiny itty bitty waist, which is, I think it's the hyperness of each genre. The genre. Because I don't want to say it's fully hyper masculinity, because that can be the toxic trait, but it's the exaggeration, the cartoonish level of that presentation of gender. So James Mansfield is notoriously very voluptuous, big hair, big lips, and you even brought up why not Marilyn Monroe, and I think there is a je ne sais quoi about Jane Mansfield that is just over the top. Because with Marilyn Monroe, it was quite orchestrated and contained. Obviously, things like Gentlemen Prefer Blondes is a great example of campiness, but she doesn't embody camp. Where I think Jane Mansfield is a drag queen who I love, big fan, avid listener. But it's, this over sincerity, over the top. We also talked about an example of this over masculine identity would be the drawings of Tom Finland, which also crosses into homosexuality. It's that leather daddy aesthetic, which she also writes in Aesthetics of Fascism, 10 out of 10 recommend. But it's that overcommitment to the bit. And you look at a picture, you look at one of these drawings and you're like, there is no sense of irony in this. It is ironic, but it's not. It's going into that weird place where you sort of don't know where it lands, but you're like, wow, that's camp.
So I want to think about all of these things we just spoke about, because, I'm a sociologist now. I think about society today.
Oh my god. Society.
So I want to think about today. And one thing I kind of noticed when I was reading most of the people that I think it's alluded to, and maybe it's because of the time period, but Susan Sontag mostly brings up kind of white references, white people, things related to white people. And so unfortunately, I think sometimes, at least as far as I was reading it, there becomes an association between camp and whiteness. And I just don't think that's the case when you think about today. You also think about, maybe it was not potentially being, like, it doesn't make sense when you think about Sontag as a person to kind of ignore this. So maybe, yeah, I don't know.
I think it was really interesting how Sontag, so I'm gonna do like a sort of roundabout way of getting back to this answer, because Sontag, what really stood out, and I even wrote it in my notes and I lost my mind because it's been years since I read this, she mentioned mostly white subjects. I'm not surprised. It's 1964. A lot of the big pop culture icons are white. The one that she mentioned, La Lupe, who is this amazing Cuban jazz boogaloo singer that was kicked out of Cuba, moved to the United States, learned English, and sings in a very heavy Cuban accent. And she's also a woman of color. So not only is she not native to the United States, she is an immigrant. She is in a male-dominated field, which is Latino culture in general. Lots of like machismo, like, and then she is a woman of color and she is succeeding and she is over the top. If you would go on YouTube and see her performances, they're insane. She used to sing and she gets so into the song that she would start taking off her clothing, and she had like giant rings, and she was just like, she sang with like a very heavy vibrato. She's over the top. And where I think it's really amazing that Sontag is pulling this out is because La Lupe was starting off in the early 60s. So Susan Sontag is looking at what is now called the Spanish Renaissance in New York City, which is not really Spain Spanish, but like Latino culture, Latinx, Latine, what have you. That is starting to rise because Puerto Ricans and Cubans are having to move out of their native homes into New York City, and because we're a familial structure, we all live on top of each other. And the music that's coming out of this is insane and it's amazing. And she's looking at that like, oh, this is camp. And I don't know if she had the correct vocabulary yet to describe what was happening.
Yeah.
And which is why I think there is a lack of color in this essay. It's not just because Holly was predominantly white, because it still is, but because people weren't seen. And finally, these types of mediums are becoming much more popular. This is also the rise of the New York City blackouts, which eventually would become hip hop. So these things are not happening in a vacuum. She's sort of in a weird space between not the end of white culture and camp, but the inclusion, the very gradual, slow inclusion of people of color. Because if you think about it, 10 years later, you have things like Studio 54, which disco is a black medium. It's a black and gay medium, and usually both.
Yeah.
White people came to disco much later. So culture is starting to be set forth by people of color. So when you think about camp now, the main camp people, I would say, are people of color.
Yeah, definitely. Because also we see this a little bit with the Met Gala. So when was it? I didn't have the date on my. When was the Met Gala?
I went on a spiel about Boogaloo. Thank you for allowing that.
No. That was really interesting because I think it's like if we think about the context. Thinking about what she's between, because it's very easy for us to kind of look back and go, well, she's not including people of color, but actually, could she have done, and what was she looking at, and what was she exposed to at the time, and thinking about these things.
And it's like, obviously she could have used references. Black people existed.
I was thinking, do you know, like, when I'm thinking about the androgyny, I recently wrote a whole article for a book that's coming out, not like a huge article, like a small summary of butch and femmes, right? And butch and femme culture, it was very connected, and a lot of it came from black culture, right? And so when I think of butch and femme women who are doing this like extreme of femininity and masculinity, right, in lots of ways. But whether she would have had like exposure to that, I'm not sure.
It's why you can say a white woman is butch, but you can't call her a stud.
Yeah.
Because there is a specific cultural reference, and specifically African American. I see it here in the UK because I'm on the apps. I can admit that. But there's like femme looking for a stud. And obviously, who can use those types of languages is very complicated and should be the people that it represents, not random white women.
Yeah.
As I have seen UK do better. But there's specific language with this. Can your existence or your identity be considered camp in that way? And I think that's where the essay sort of falls flat, because I don't think Susan Sontag had I'm saying her full name, because it's such a good name.
Yeah, I know. We've been doing it throughout.
Susan. Let's call her first name. We're friends now. And I think this is going into things that she has seen, but she knows better than to comment on.
Yeah.
And, in this essay, she also mentions Jewish people. And I think it's a really important part as well, because New York City, if you do not know, I think has one of the largest Jewish populations outside of Israel. Like, even when I lived in New York, you live amongst Jewish people. You use Yiddish slang, which I didn't realize was Yiddish slang till I moved to the UK. And now there's a huge debate, a very good debate that is beyond both of our capabilities about, like, is Jewishness a race or ethnicity? That is beyond us, and don't email us about it, because it is very complicated, especially to the people that live this every single day. But she makes it a point to mention it because at this time period, Jewish people were not considered white. They were considered other. And they, to some degree, still are considered other. So she's trying to work these themes in of race and of gender and all these things. But it's 1964. How much progressiveness can you ask from a text?
Yeah. Thinking about all kind of forms of many different forms of marginalization and how that connects to camp. So I was gonna think and kind of move us on to thinking about the Met Gala, which took place
in 2019, I believe.
2019, I believe, yeah. So in 2019, there was a Met Gala with the theme camp, but it wasn't just camp, it was specifically Susan Sontag's notes on camp, I believe. And so I think there's something interesting here about the representation of camp on display in the Met Gala, and specifically thinking about the commercialization of camp, because we've spoken about the replication of camp and camp's relationship to aura and replicas. And I think there's something interesting in here about commercialization. And I know you have an interesting thing to say about pop art and stuff like that, so maybe we start there.
About what?
Pop art.
Oh.
Sorry, I said it really weird.
Pop art.
Pop art.
Pop art. Do you might want to take that one again?
Okay. I don't know how else to say.
Pop art.
Pop art. Okay, right.
Pop art.
Pop art. I can't say it. Okay.
If you said it too fast, you have to slow it down.
Okay. And I think there's something interesting that you had to say about pop art, which is kind of introduced very fastly at the very end of the essay. Just like, haha, and then run away.
I think the entire essay is her like dropping all these facts on us and then like running away as quickly as possible. But pop art is based on commercialization. It is Andy Warhol's soup cans and the replicating images that he does, especially if you think of the Marilyn Monroe, the Elvis Presley one. And then there's other people like Lichtenstein that's replicating comic book designs and putting really existential situations like the climactic moment of a comic as the canvas. And these are camp. And it's not the commercialization itself that's camp, it's the genuineness attached to it. It's the pop art is the idea of popular culture on display. and kind of making fun of it. Specifically, like, Andy Warhol will, like, do anything for a buck. And his sincerity and genuineness to just make money, camp.
That kind of reminds me of the guy who made Vanta Black, the Black is Black paint, that kind of artist. Mm-hmm. I feel like you would know.
Oh, do I know about the drama?
But just before we go into the drama, I feel like the connection is that he's also dedicated to making.
See, actually, I'm going to counter it.
Oh.
So what's his name? Kapoor?
Yeah, Anish Kapoor.
Anish Kapoor made the Black is Black and tried to, like, copyright it and, like, just, like, be the only person in charge of this color. And then Stuart Semple came in and was like, I'm gonna make the Black is Black. And Stuart Semple is basically just fighting Kapoor for the Black is Black. And I think that interaction is camp. Where it's like, no, I'm gonna do it. No, I'm gonna do it. And if I'm remembering correctly, this is off of the top of my dome. I believe Semple opened it up to people, so I think it is an open...
Oh, he's got a whole thing on Wikipedia that says conflict with Anish Kapoor.
Because that's camp.
So, Kapoor purchased the rights to Vanta Black in 2016. Semple positioned himself at the forefront of this backlash when he released Pink, the world's pinkest pink paint, in retaliation. Semple explicitly banned Kapoor from buying this paint, stating, "We all remember kids at school who wouldn't share their colouring pencils, but then they ended up on their own with no friends. It's cool, Anish can have his black, but the rest of us will be playing with the rainbow."
That's camp.
And then... on the 3rd of February 2017, Semple hit back at Kapoor by releasing his own version of Vanta Black, dubbed Better Black. And Semple admits the paint isn't perfect, but says it's better because it's affordable and available to everyone. And then Black 2.0 followed 30th of March 2017, and then Semple's Culture Hustle released a Black 3.0 and Diamond Dust, which is the world's most glittery glitter, equally forbidden to Kapoor.
See, that is camp. So this is why I was like, no, we should actually get it out. It's absolutely that ridiculousness,
and they really committed.
They're both committing to it. Well, I would say Anish Kapoor is not camp. The situation's camp, and Semple's absolute, like, deviousness to just start banning Kapoor from using this color, that is camp. So I think this is like, I think that's you accidentally landed into the most perfect example.
Wow.
Of, like, commercialization of camp.
Who knew I'm smart?
We all did. In that genuineness, camp. I'm so sorry that, like, the half of this is just us giggling. This is how it's been in our household for, like,
we're just
weeks.
screaming at each other, and my partner's just standing between us being like, what the hell is that?
And I'm like, that's camp. but back to commercialization.
Yes.
But that was an excellent example, because it is dealing with copyright. It's dealing with the ability to replicate this paint. And of course, it's a consumable good. It's also not original, as we all know, but it can be camp. So, like, these are, like, camp can be anything from an underground, I want to say, like, culture club type of thing, to all the way up to, like, just ridiculous events and ridiculous moments. And it also doesn't have to be art. There's many things that are camp. I was going through a Vox article that listed, like, moments in politics that were camp, and to keep this as apolitical as possible, I'm not going to mention it, but maybe look up that Vox article. But yeah, camp is not specifically designated to the art.
So I wanted to talk about and kind of end on thinking about social media and memes. I don't know why, I just did. I want to talk about camp, but I want to specifically talk about the Karlie Kloss meme.
10 out of 10.
And if you've not seen it, Google it. Google looking camp straight in the eye.
It's what we named this file on our podcast.
Yeah, but to describe it to you, because this is an audio medium, it's essentially Karlie Kloss. She's a model. She's got a, what's it called?
Hand mirror.
She's got a hand mirror, and she's looking into the hand mirror, but you can only see the back of her head, and you can see the eye, like her eye looking back.
Yeah, it's the eye is in focus in the mirror.
Yeah, and then she turns up to the Met Gala.
We need to also explain that she put this on Twitter before she actually attended the Met Gala.
So she puts this on Twitter. She then goes to the Met Gala. She turns up in the most hideous mini gold dress.
It's
I've
also
ever seen.
not on theme.
It's not on theme.
It's not a good dress.
She really hyped it up.
I mean, she's beautiful. So she makes everything look beautiful.
That dress is horrible.
The dress is horrible.
It's quilted, isn't it? No.
Yeah, it was like quilted gold with like a weird black band. And I'm doing this off the top of my head.
Yeah. I have not looked at this thing in ages.
And it cut to me being like, I can tell you I can tell you the temperature was that day. Because I was part of the Twitter hate.
Yeah.
I was just like, because I love the Met Gala.
Yeah.
And I will say a controversial statement. I think the V&A does their fashion exhibitions much better than the Met Gala, except for the one on Catholicism. That's where the Met took the cake. But in general, the V&A is much better, and Fashioning Masculinities is so good. Anyways, but her turning up to the Met Gala dressed hideously after giving so much hype has become a camp statement. At the time, absolutely not. We were all enraged. We're like, Karlie,
and
girl.
watch me connect this to notes on camp, right? So note 30. I'm going to do the whole note because it's not very big. Note 30, quote, "Of course the canon of camp can change. Time has a great deal to do with it. Time may enhance what seems simply dogged or lacking in fantasy now because we are too close to it, because it resembles too closely our own everyday fantasies, the fantastic nature of which we don't perceive. We are better able to enjoy a fantasy as fantasy when it's not our own." And I think there's something interesting there about the movement of time and how that affects what we perceive as camp. Because from my memory, that Karlie Kloss Twitter was kind of hated on at the time.
Yes.
But now, that image is camp.
Yeah, it's also the two images. The original, like, posted one on Twitter with the stock photo, which is, I think, also a really good duality, because it's the one which is the self-enclosed self, her image of herself, like she's like looking camp straight in the eye, and then the reality of everyone else's perception of her. So these two things are are in juxtaposition, and that is what makes it funny and camp. Not funny because it's camp or camp because it's funny. It's those two things at once. And I think the last quote, I'm gonna quote camp finally, and it's the last one.
Sorry, I feel like I've been like, quote.
No. I think this essay truly changed your life.
It did. I've changed forever. For the better, who knows?
So the last quote, I've been calling a couple of things like the thesis statement, but I think this is the magnus opus. It is the ultimate camp statement. It's good because it's awful. Of course, one can't always say that. Only under certain conditions, those which I've tried to sketch in these notes. And
Mic drop.
yeah, like it's just, there's something about like, it's good because it's awful. And that is a really hard thing to define and to live. And I think that's where like genuineness and all these things come together. It's the appreciation, the love for that thing that doesn't have to be good or bad. It's just your love for that exact thing. And the Karlie Kloss meme, it's the love she has for herself.
Oh yeah.
Which is the meme. Which is what makes it camp. She is so sincere and genuine. She thinks she's gonna turn heads and she believes in herself. And then the juxtaposition of it, it's
so
chef's
funny.
kisses.
Like everybody else came, like there was some bad looks, right? There was some not great looks, just generally. But then if you imagine this like tiny gold dress next to like Lady Gaga's like a dress that changes. You've got who wore the Cinderella one?
Mrs. Holland.
Yeah. Zendaya. Yeah, Zendaya wore the LED Cinderella dress that like lit up and everything, and then you've got Janelle Monáe with the like eye that closes on the dress that blinks, and you turned up in a gold dress.
Oh, we're forgetting one big gold person, which is
who is the gold person?
A good comparison would be Karlie Kloss's gold thing, just a tube, versus like Billy Porter's full-on performance, where he comes out with like wings. So like he just gives the performance of a lifetime. It is just like over the top, glitzy, and it's also good. It's a really good costume. You wouldn't see that and be like, haha. You'd be like, no, damn, that is beautiful. That is a lot of craftsmanship. It's a lot of work. But it's the way that he uses it that is camp. Whereas like he was an instantaneous like camp factor, Karlie Kloss took a bit. And I think that is also a really good exploration of this text. Are we done on camp for now?
Yeah, I feel like that was our concluding thoughts. We really did it.
We now know how to define camp.
Maybe.
Absolutely not. That was a joke.
No.
That was not sincere or genuine.
I do not know how to define camp, but I know it when I see it, and that's all I need to know. I wanted to, so you have a fan fiction, but I wanted to end on your fan fiction because I haven't seen it, heard it.
I haven't really read it either. It was one of those like I found. I was like, I don't want to read this, but it is funny.
But instead of doing fan fiction, I wanted to read out because in note 22, Susan Sontag talks about Oscar Wilde and his epigrams, and I wanted to finish with some examples of these epigrams because they make me laugh. So these are some of the quotations from various different texts and plays and things that Wilde has done. One of them is, I can resist everything except temptation. There is only one thing in the world worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about, which is from The Picture of Dorian Gray. Everyone should read. When people agree with me, I always feel that I must be wrong. Nothing that is worth knowing can be taught. To live is the rarest thing in the world. Most people exist, that is all. And the last one, which is my favorite by far, is the play was a great success, but the audience was a disaster. And those are camp.
So mine is a fan fiction called Saint Rosa and the Swallows, or Notes on Camp, by Secret. Oh my god. OMG. Summary. Scrap. To fulfill a graduation requirement, Stan, from South Park, decides to adapt Sontag's Notes on Camp into a musical.
Incredible.
So the entire fic is using High School Musical meets South Park meets Susan Sontag's Notes on Camp. And this is ingenious. It is only one chapter. It's under 2,000 words. Read it if you want.
Yeah, that's impressive. Also, I feel like that in itself is camp.
Yeah. The person writing this, camp.
Yeah.
Not the thing itself, the action of writing this.
The moment of being like, genius.
Yeah,
Let's connect these three things.
The lightning bolt that struck that day.
But yeah,
I think that's it.
That was Notes on Camp. I hope you know what camp is now. I don't know.
And it's not camping.
Nope.
Like,
somebody made a camping joke to me. Simon did. He came in and made the most dad camping joke. It was about tents. I don't know.
He should stick to writing against capitalism. All right. On that wonderful note.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.